Hello, everyone. Um, Thank you, relatives, for hanging in there with us. Welcome back for our final presentation of the day. Before we start, I have a code to give away. For those of you who are keeping track and playing the virtual scavenger hunt code quest, your code is persevere. That's persevere. Yes, thank you for putting it up on the screen because I think I barely read that right. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to David Adams. David is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and has served as chief prosecutor for the Pueblo of Laguna and U.S. Attorney's Office's tribal liaison as an assistant U.S. attorney. And they will be presenting on sovereignty and safety. David, please take the floor.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today to discuss, some difficult topics that impact all of our communities. I feel very fortunate to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women to be able to participate in this conference. It's been a few years since I have. The last time I have participated in the Tribal Leadership Conference was when I was at the Department of Justice. So a fairly different perspective. Given that I was doing nothing but violent crime at the time. And so when asked about what topic I was going to talk about, I have this, from the past few years of the work that I've been doing, I have a different perspective as to the evolution of sovereignty and how violent crime has evolved. And of course, we have a pandemic that has impacted us all and has caused a different level of trauma in our community that's relevant in this discussion as well. In addition to that, I think there's also the awareness that power and authority and leadership, when unchecked with proper checks and balances, can also lead to additional traumas in our community. And we see it happening on the federal level, on the state level. And we as tribal communities have such a unique opportunity to do more because of the small communities that we come from and how we can have change effectuated through our councils and through laws that we can pass. And so through this, I'm going to share some stories of some individuals that I've worked with in the past. I'm going to share some of the things that I see happening based upon the work that I do now, and hopefully end by making some simple suggestions and solutions as how we can do better within our communities. So again, thank you very much to the Coalition. Thank you to the tribal leaders that are present today. It means a lot by you being here because the change comes from the leadership in our communities. And so you carrying this message forward is also extremely important. I'm going to have at least hopefully 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers if you do have questions regarding any of the information I'm going to present. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the number of advocates that are present today. I think that over doing this kind of work over the last 15 years, you certainly get a different appreciation for the level of commitment that it takes from victim advocates to work with individuals that have gone through trauma in the community. And then the vicarious trauma that victim advocates face by having to deal with this trauma and the extra burden of helping people change lives is an extremely important task and role that sometimes we underappreciate in terms of how important it is. And so I really want to applaud the advocates that are involved, that thanks to the Coalition, I get to also participate in training a few times a year. So, and then I just acknowledge Amber Crotty and Paula Feathers and Angel for their presentations this morning, which were inspiring and make me excited to do this work and continue doing this work in the future. The biggest thing, when I think about this too, is I remember being at the U.S. Attorney's Office and talking about how the statistics when it comes to the disparity between different races, political groups are so much different in how they impact Native American women, sometimes 3 to 5 times higher than the national average. And my hope was that, oh wow, we're prosecuting these things, we're having laws change, Violence Against Women's Act is changing the laws in our communities. These stats must be changing. And unfortunately, over time, I'm learning that these stats aren't changing. And you start to see the different things that are happening or not happening that are kind of impacting that process. And so I hope that you leave the presentation today thinking about a couple of things that you can do within your community to help effectuate change when it comes to these high disparate statistics when it comes to crimes against women and children. Even though my faith in the justice system sometimes crumbles due to what you see happen in the system on the federal, state, and tribal level, I still have faith that healing comes through the justice system. It is one of the few areas of recourse that victims of violent crime have is through the justice system. And so creating a voice in the justice system is extremely important. And so thinking about the unique ways and how we can have that voice created in the justice system, whether or not we give Jane Doe the opportunity to have that voice and advocate for that person in our court systems. One of the unique challenges that we have in this process is the federal trust responsibility that was talked about this morning. So many of our cases, we rely upon the federal government in terms of prosecuting these major crimes and giving Jane Doe a voice in that system. And one of the questions that I've been asking myself throughout this process is, by not giving Jane Doe a voice in our own tribal court systems, if that is kind of holding up some of the healing that can take place when it comes to moving forward and becoming a survivor. So a large part of my presentation is going to be talking about the justice system that we see compromised at many different levels when it comes to the federal and state side, and how we as tribal communities can hopefully prevent some of those things from happening in the future. I undoubtedly believe that mental health is a huge component to moving forward in a way where we help curb these stats. I think you see a trend overall, not just in our tribal communities, but in the country, recognizing and realizing that, hey, if you have trauma or experience trauma, or have some type of depression or anxiety that's unaddressed, it creates issues. And do we provide the mental health access to individuals that experience these things? At a national level, I can say confidently, we absolutely don't. I can say that out of all of the cases that we have in our office, for instance, that anybody that wants to get access to mental health is put on a waiting list. And sometimes that waiting list is months before somebody can get access to that type of care. Then I think about individuals that suffer the worst type of trauma that somebody can experience, whether it be at the hands of a loved one or a violent crime that causes physical and emotional injury. What kind of access to mental health care do they have in our communities? And the answer is they don't always have that care. And then you look at one of the most troubling statistics that we frequently don't talk enough about, which is the actual suicide rate amongst Native Americans in all of our communities, which is nearly double the national average, especially between the ages of 10 and 24 years old. If you really dive into that stat in itself and you realize that per capita that we are facing a suicide epidemic at twice the national average, to me, that creates basically a situation of why I'm here today talking about these issues, is because I think that the impact that this particular issue has on our communities is extremely detrimental in terms of moving forward in the future. And so one thing to take from this is that I hope that our leadership acknowledges that mental health is a huge component of moving forward when it comes to trauma, and making sure that we have the resources available in our community for individuals that experience this type of trauma. Not just for the individuals that experience the violent crime itself, but I think it's fair to say that studies will also show that the frontline workers involved in responding to that, law enforcement, social workers, therapists, and any individuals that work with individuals that suffer some type of violent crime also need help. If you have any degree of compassion, empathy, or passion for the work that you do, you're gonna have tears shed, frequently in this type of job because of what you see happening. Most advocates that we have in this field work in the community that work and live in the community that they're from. And so just that in itself makes it that much more damaging when you see these types of things happening. When I say see these types of things happening, a lot of these things are things that nobody else knows about because of confidentiality and because of the advocacy that takes place. So these stories aren't often told. And I think sharing and telling the stories more often, I think will help us do better and come up with better solutions to the issues we have regarding mental health and the high rate of suicide in our communities. And just an example, I could spend my entire time in this presentation talking about the number of minor children that I've worked with in the communities that have experienced some type of trauma. And this one in particular is more recent, and in the last 6 months that I talked with this individual. And part of me doing this, I think, and sharing these stories, I do it because I don't want it to just be things that come from me and the perspective that I see when it comes to the work that we do. And so I think hearing directly from individuals that experience these types of things is extremely important. In this particular case, a child had a father that abandoned the child at a very, very young age, and the mom ended up in the criminal justice system and eventually was unable to get custody of the child. And so the child was then placed as a ward of the court and under the care of social services. This is a much longer discussion about social services and our foster care system in our communities, but oftentimes when children are placed in foster care, I think that we could all unanimously agree that those are situations where they've experienced some type of trauma. If you've done any work when it comes to adverse childhood experiences, you know from that any type of trauma for a child creates a situation where they may be more likely to X in the future or Y in the future. X and Y can be using drugs or alcohol to cope. It can be attempted suicide in the future. It could be teen pregnancy. It can be health conditions that come from it. It can be acting out in aggressive ways, abusive ways, all things that come from adverse childhood experiences. In this particular situation, this child had experienced adverse experience after adverse experience, from being punched in the face, and she remembered walking into the bedroom having blood drip down her lips, with tears in her eyes because she spilled cereal at 7 years old that resulted in getting punched in the face, and punched in the face a number of times, and then sitting at a table and then being told you were broke and needed help. I don't know why we took you on. You're nothing but a hassle to our family. And then I talked to this person at 17 years old, and to think about the idea that they've overcome 4 suicide attempts that have landed in the hospital, which was their way of dealing with the trauma that they've experienced, and without the help of anybody, deciding that they want to make a change. Part of this stemmed from the fact that this person was placed into a family member that was related to the social services representative that was involved in this particular case. And then when the family, when the assaults were happening, because of the relationship, nobody wanted to report it because nobody wanted to get anybody in trouble. And if this is the type of way we handle childhood trauma, the epidemic of suicide that we see happening is going to be happening more and more and more. So what does it mean when this young lady contacts me now, where I don't do any type of criminal prosecution work, and what can I do? Is the really, really, really difficult question and answer as to what we can do to address this particular situation. And I'm going to address that in a minute when I talk more about sovereignty and the lawyers that work in the field that can be helpful in addressing these types of situations. In addition to mental health, as we talked about before, I think the matrix of trauma, when it comes to some of the things that happen in our community, it requires an analysis of looking at many different facets of what impacts trauma and how we help victims become survivors, whether or not it's just a court system involved, whether or not it's just law enforcement involved or council members involved, but it also comes down to our own physical health as well and how we are treated. And I think that we could all unanimously agree that access to healthcare matters in this process. Is it equitable care? We've all been dealing with the idea that we have IHS facilities in our communities that are, in many cases, doing really well. In other cases, extremely neglectful when it comes to the health care that we need, especially when it comes to trauma and violent crime. If you've worked as in law enforcement capacity or even in the advocacy capacity, we've all been in situations where we see somebody transported to IHS, but then may have to wait a long period of time before getting a helicopter transport to a larger hospital where they can receive the care that they need. Or what kind of effort do we have to make as a family to have access to quality food that we might want to have? Do we have grocery stores in nearby areas that provide all these things that help provide us the nutrients that we need? And when I think about some of these things, I think about the assimilation process and how that has taken place over years of time. And these are parts and examples of still the kind of poisonous nature of the food that we have, for instance, or the healthcare that we have, and how that still impacts our community. So I bring these up just because all of these factors also play into health, well-being, sovereignty, and safety for those in the community. Sovereignty is an interesting concept that has been defined and redefined through case law over years, and is an interesting conversation to have with a group of friends that talk about these particular issues frequently, because it's one of the most important concepts to our governmental existence as tribal communities. When asked about what the definition is for sovereignty, I think the short definition that I often hear would be just the ability and right to self-govern. That means that we, as all tribal communities, have the ability to self-govern, to create a governing body, establish laws in our community, and to have an equal place at the table when it comes to federal, state, and tribal relationships. I bring that up because this isn't something that I worked on overnight to figure out a presentation of what I was going to present at today. I've been thinking about this for months. I lay in bed thinking about these particular issues because I want to be an advocate in moving forward in terms of how we can do better. And so sovereignty is one of those areas that I spend a lot of time critiquing and understanding in terms of how it impacts we as individuals that live in tribal communities. 20 years ago, when going to law school, I could say that the Pre-Law Summer Institute and the Indian law programs that are created to help Indian lawyers become working in our communities and to protect this concept of sovereignty and establishment of our tribal governments. And a great deal of that work was based upon the history, the racist history of the Supreme Court, and how that impacted our ability to self-govern over time. I think it was fair to say that a great deal of that effort is put in towards creating a mindset that we need to protect the integrity of our tribal governments and ensure that they have a place at the table when it comes to building relationships and with the federal and state government, having economic relationships established where we have contracts and business created and jobs for our community. And that is without a doubt extremely important. The progression of that, in my opinion, has been extremely successful. And I think that was mentioned earlier that we've got Deb Haaland in Washington, D.C. In a position that was that a Native American woman has never had in the past. And then we have representatives in the Washington, D.C. arena, in the state arena, coming from our communities. And so we see a seat at the table when it comes to a lot of these issues. And we're more successful by the year when it comes to having that same level playing field when it comes to sovereign relationships. The flip side to that is that we, at some point in time, neglect our own citizens in that process because the focus was so much upon the government. And so I think that the shift for sovereignty for me, which is the title of the presentation, is that it also is safety. And to have leadership understand that sovereignty also means looking out for the community in every way possible. So I'm going to look at a few areas that we don't look out for the community as much as we should, and just talk about a couple of things we can do to address that in the future. I mean, one particular area when it comes to sovereignty that I think that we see happen across the country is the checks and balances behind those that we put in power. And most troubling over the period of the last, 5 years, but I guess that's a progression that takes place over a longer period of time, is seeing people in power in political positions and in positions involving the justice system where that type of integrity is compromised. In my opinion, when you have that type of layer of justice and politics and governing bodies have the integrity of that system compromised without a check and balance, we end up in a situation where that sovereignty is compromised. And I use the examples that you see on the screen right now more so as an idea just so you can see what's happening in the federal and state system, because eventually it's going to bleed into our own governments as well, unless we have safeguards in place to prevent that from happening. And so, the same concept you see here is part of that diminishment of sovereignty. And what we're going to be talking about is that when you see a body of individuals, affect the integrity and create a different narrative about what leadership might be or what is important for a community or what is happening in our community, And if that narrative includes any type of false narrative or information that isn't accurate, it puts us in a situation where we have to find the truth. And sometimes finding the truth is extremely expensive, tiresome, and burdensome. And so I want you to think of that from a tribal member citizen perspective of how difficult it is in situations to determine what is going on and how it impacts you in the community. And sometimes that means, I don't know if this is impacting my legal rights. I'm going to call an attorney. And so when you think about an individual calling an attorney, most attorneys, their time is valuable. They have, they bill hours, they have individuals they're responsible for. And so when they talk, they're billing time. How many attorneys do we have available for individuals in our tribal communities that have issues happen that impact them on a traumatic level through violent crime that can assist them? And the answer is not very many. We don't afford public defenders in most of our court systems. We allow individuals to represent themselves. We have prosecutors that sometimes in situations prosecute them without necessarily affording them what their rights might be. We have situations that come up where many attorneys cannot help individual tribal members because they are representing tribal governments, and there's a conflict between helping a tribal member and helping the tribal government. So it's a very, very small group of individuals that really look out for tribal member interests when it comes to these particular issues. Why do I bring this up as being extremely important? And arguably, this may be one of the most important parts of the presentation, because I see a trend happening when it comes to some of the investigations that I'm involved in, but also investigations that I see taking place that impact the integrity of our entire governing body in our tribal community. You'll see the provision here on the bottom of the screen that says the waiver allows BIA to unilaterally establish a CFR court and allows the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs to appoint a magistrate without the need for confirmation by the tribal governing body. When you think about the trust responsibility, and I think one of the fears many, many years ago about that trust responsibility is that it creates an attachment of strings to every single dollar that we expend in our community. And so all of these programs that we have that are federally funded programs have strings attached that require audits, that require providing reports to the federal government on a sometimes bi-yearly basis. That last provision you see on the screen there is what can happen if we don't have proper safeguards in place to ensure the integrity of these processes working. So in that situation there, that actually happened to one of our communities here in New Mexico that had a operating court system that didn't involve the federal government, and because a history of a violation of individuals' rights in that court system and not having proper due process take place led to a series of complaints, and those complaints go to another higher federal court, and those complaints are heard by another federal body. And so because of the federal funding aspect to it, it gave the feds the right to come in and to start running the court system themselves until things can be changed within that court system. So could you imagine that concept of sovereignty, the ability and the right to self-govern that we talked about before, and how quickly through plenary power that can be taken away if we don't create a robust system that we can rely upon as a community and feel safe in the checks and balances that exist there. So if anything from this, I think one of the biggest things to think about is the attachment of those dollars to these programs and how important it is to make sure that we protect that integrity. Another example quickly would just be, a ton of calls that we get throughout the year from individuals that have either been sexually harassed or have faced some type of wrongful termination or discrimination in the workplace. And because of the concept of sovereign immunity and very, very narrow pathways for individuals to have recourse for those types of violations, many people do not pursue finding recourse, healing from a wrong taking place in the court systems themselves. And so what do? They then file complaints within the Department of Labor, or they file complaints with grant programs. And so my fear is now and will continue to be until we provide some really strong safeguards over these things, is that we're going to have a lot of these programs lose funding in situations where we don't have safeguards in place to protect the integrity of these programs. And so I think in going forward, even though I understand that codification is not something we want to get into as much in many communities, but there are situations where codification helps create protocols, procedures, and safeguards that prevent the integrity of these programs from being compromised by sometimes individuals that either don't know what they're doing, or they do know what they're doing and they just make mistakes that end up being sometimes criminal or civil in nature. I want to, an example, part of some of the stories that I'm sharing throughout this is that I have had many cases where I've worked with an individual that had justice served in a different capacity, if that word is the right word to use. And in this particular case, I had an individual that was 15 years old that had reported to a school counselor a 2-year period of being sexually assaulted by a family member. And the way that this was handled was in such a way where she never had a voice to talk about this beyond what happened in a meeting involving certain individuals. And she was under the assumption that that meeting was going to lead to healing for the uncle as well. And that because it was a traditional meeting that she did not have a voice and she had to kind of deal with what was advised to her by those involved in that meeting. And I know that there's a part of ourself and our that we believe that that's part of a tradition and custom maybe that existed at some point in times in terms of providing harmony or healing in this type of situation. Having done this for as long as I have, I can tell you that that's not how trauma works. And you don't find healing through that type of process. And the number of resources that Jane Doe needed to truly overcome that type of trauma that she experienced really takes a community. I mean, it takes so many individuals involved to help guide her through this process and how she can change her life. Because of that outcome, she dropped out of school within a year's time and has not resolved the trauma that she's experienced. And so at some point in time, she's going to be an adult carrying that generational trauma, passing it on to those because of the fact that she did not have that recourse. And, if anything, I think that we want to ensure that every individual that faces any type of violent crime, specifically, especially sexual assault, let alone any type of domestic abuse, that they have a voice in a forum that protects the integrity of the seriousness of what happened to them in their particular situation. So yes, I worry about the diminishing of sovereignty. I worry about the lack of oversight we have over some of these programs and hope that we can do better when it comes to creating proper safeguards. And why this matters, I mean, I don't want to continue repeating what others have already said, but I mean, obviously, I think that it's definitely more of a trend in recent years to have an understanding as to why are we in this situation? Why do we have such a high rate of violence when it comes to women and children in our communities? And there's no doubt that generational trauma plays the most significant role when it comes to that. The colonialization, we've got assimilation that took place for it. And I think just the words of stripping anybody of their cultural identity in itself is a trauma that takes, years and years to overcome. So we have generational trauma taking place already that's from prior generations, from our grandparents, from their grandparents in certain situations. And then you combine that trauma with what we experience now in this day and age. So what kind of trauma do we have taking place in our community now? You have to ask yourself, what types of cases do you have through your court system? What kind of trauma are the children carrying on to the next generation? And so I bring up VAWA because VAWA is something that's been around for almost 30 years now with the idea of providing firm protections for women and children. It became a huge forum for advocates in tribal communities to make sure that we have laws in place to protect Jane Doe. That all stemmed from the federal trust responsibility because those laws that are in place, the forum for those laws is the federal court system. Strangulation, habitual offender, assault resulting in serious bodily injury, sexual abuse, abuse of sexual contact, interstate violations of protection orders, all of those things end up in the federal court system. So one of the things I want you to think about when going back into your community is, why not have some of these provisions passed in our own community? Why don't we have strangulation laws in our community? Why don't we have habitual offender laws? Why don't we have firmer protections when it comes to protection orders? To me, that is part of that concept of sovereignty, is passing those laws to protect individuals from those most serious types of crimes. One thing that I can say and feel fairly confident about, having done it for a decent period of time, but also having researched it for a good chunk of time as well, is that there's no way that we are going to prosecute our way out of this problem. In fact, I think the problem has only gotten worse over time, to the extent that we actually have increased prosecution by 61% since 2008. And so we have that many more individuals in the prison system. And it's relevant because the disparity, if you were to talk to anybody from the Federal Public Defender's Office, their issue with the prison system isn't with the fact that individuals committed crimes and they deserve, penal consequences for what happened. It's the disparate treatment that the federal and state system has when it comes to Native Americans specifically that commit these crimes. If a John Doe from Acoma committed a crime in the state of, within the boundaries of the state of New Mexico, and ended up in state court, the sentence that he or she would face in state court is significantly lower than they would face in federal court. And so it does create a unique situation, because those particular provisions of the law that we're talking about only apply to Native Americans. They don't apply to other groups or races of people. So you see a disparate treatment just in that sense. And so that leads to the next question, is to what are we actually doing to the trauma caused from the crime that was committed, not just to Jane Doe, but to the children in the community that are also impacted from that situation. And one thing that I can say for certain is that we do not do enough to identify all of the children that are present in the home, or just a family member of somebody that experiences some type of abuse or has a parent that goes into prison. And they're not listed in the complaint as victims. They don't get treated as victims frequently. And the problem is that we all know, based upon studies, that they've experienced an adverse childhood experience. We need to identify each of those children early on and do our best to provide them the resources that they need to overcome the trauma that they're experiencing. Sometimes we fail to catch that early on. And so the next part of the process in terms of where you can catch that is frequently the juvenile delinquency system, because my experience has been is that when you had juveniles committing certain types of crimes, you could usually identify, like, wow, this is not your typical type of crime that a juvenile would commit. And our old system was more of a punitive system. It was holding juveniles accountable, sending them off to juvenile delinquency programs, and then bringing them home and hoping they're okay. And really, the juvenile delinquency system should be geared towards helping them overcome trauma. And so I'm hoping that throughout this time frame that we can do better at identifying the children that are impacted by violent crimes, because if we really want to have a role in breaking the cycle of the violence, we have to have a role in working with children. One area that I've always believed in, and more so in recent time, is that we should actually have that just be part of our school curriculum, is having counselors available, not just when something happens, but just having them available to talk about trauma, go into classrooms and talk about healing, talk about how the brain works, talk about depression, talk about anxiety, all of these things that impact our children, and having a forum for them to understand it so they can get better in that process. Why? Because we talk about this generational trauma and we think about it in the perspective of like, oh, that's our grandparents that experienced it. It's our youth now, because the youth are the ones that are suffering from their parents that have committed these particular crimes that we're talking about, heinous, violent crimes. And so the parents were carrying the generational trauma of their parents. And now we have the children not only carrying that generational trauma, they're carrying the trauma of being firsthand victims of this type of thing happening. And if the stats aren't changing, you only have to do the math once to figure out how scary it is in terms of the cycle and the direction that it could be going. And I'm giving you my subjective perspective based upon cases that I had. And I did the math, and I've said this before, and I'll continue saying it, is if I prosecuted 50 felonies in 1 year, that typically meant that I had about 105 children that were impacted from 50 people that went to prison. And so even though in the mindset of you got 50 people going to prison, the reaching impact of that traumatic incident was way deeper, because that wasn't just 50 people, it's 105 children. And the care that those 105 children received, I can tell you, was not what it should be in order to break that cycle of violence. And so we've got to do more on helping children overcome what they see, what they hear, and giving them the idea that life can be better under different circumstances. It's essential. Trauma-informed care is a buzzword that we should be using all of the time. It applies to everybody that works with any individual that has experienced some type of trauma. In the school system especially, I think we all have heard the stories where teachers single out or isolate individuals that might have some type of behavioral issue, that if you looked into it, you would understand that behavior issue probably stems from trauma. The same thing can be mentioned about the prison system. If you went into a women's prison, let alone a male prison, the individuals that are in there are all individuals that have also experienced some type of trauma. So the point being is we've got to do more to identify that at a very, very young age. This is Tiffany Reed. I bring up Tiffany because for a whole variety of reasons. I sit on 2 separate task forces for missing, murdered, and Indigenous women. I've gotten phone calls from families like you wouldn't believe, from all over the place, about, can you help me figure out what to do in this situation? Can you help me turn this alleged suicide into a homicide because we know somebody was involved, whatever it might be. In this particular situation, what troubles me the most is that, she went missing 18 years ago. And the family had reached out because they couldn't find any information about anything that had been done to locate her at all. And so when somebody calls me in this particular issue, I bring it up because I don't have a nonprofit. It's not a situation where I have the resources to be able to provide every type of individual an investigation to resolve these types of situations, which makes me appreciate the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, Tewa Women United, and all the nonprofits that we have that are a voice for individuals, because they're essential in getting the message out. I also know that the average person couldn't even begin to start investigating what happened here because of the multiple law enforcement agencies involved. And so where do you even begin? What FBI personnel do you contact? What BIA personnel do you contact? What tribal representative has the information? And what I can tell you that I learned that disturbed me the most in this particular situation is that there is no police report. There is no report that exists. And if there is, nobody's been able to get it. There is uncertainty whether or not this was ever entered into a criminal information database. We did know that she had belongings that were located in Arizona at one point in time, but if her information was not entered in the criminal database, whoever found those belongings in Arizona would never have been able to know that this person was a missing person. And so all that we have to go forward in this particular situation is that the notes from a mom that is no longer here that did everything she could to find her daughter. So I know that the Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women task forces and all of the wonderful things that are coming from it are super, super important. But within our own communities, we also have to turn the lens around and be critical about what we are doing to identify these individuals at a very early stage as being a missing person and not a runaway. Or I think it was mentioned earlier that they wanted to not be found. That has been the thought process for so many years when it comes to individuals that end up missing, is that they did not want to be found. In certain situations, especially in the realm of domestic abuse, that could be true. But when it comes to minors missing, sovereignty equals safety, and we can do more and ensuring that we have safeguards in place to have notifications in place when this type of thing happens. Tiffany, it's a long story, but it has taken years to get an investigation opened into this particular situation. And even though everyone says the resources are there and that there's all kinds of things happening, it's still not quite happening at the level that we need. In fact, I would say that people have been more successful in social media and Facebook and Instagram and being helpful and helping locate and identify missing, murdered, and Indigenous women. You see this amazing network of individuals through Facebook that share, and next thing you know, you've got somebody from Montana or Wyoming and everyone else sharing this information, which is becoming a huge part of identifying the large population of missing and murdered Indigenous women that we see in our communities. One of the, and sometimes I hate talking about this stuff because I feel like I'm being critical about things that happen and are currently happening, but at some point in time, I gotta not care about that. And this is one of those times. It has been discouraging to me for years to look at codes, tribal codes, that do not afford a Victims' Rights Act. And I believe in the fact that if you identify what rights they have in the court system, that we will then enforce those rights because you have recourse if they're not enforced. What do these rights do specifically for our tribal communities is it provides Jane Doe with notice, with a voice in the courtroom, with the opportunity to talk to a prosecutor about what a plea agreement is. And I think about disparate treatment, and Jane Doe from Tribe A should not be able to go into a state and federal court and have those rights enforced, but not have them enforced in their own community. So I guess the second most important thing that I would say today is that this is just something that cannot happen anymore. And it is a simple fix, because this is not reinventing the wheel. You could literally copy any type of Victims' Rights Act from any particular community and use that as your own. And so you can't click the link here, but you could type that link into your browser. And I believe if you search down to codified rights, you'll see a Victims' Rights Act, and you can click it on my website and it's going to pull up a PDF document, and it's more or less going to give you the same version of the Victims' Rights Act that applies in federal court. And I encourage you to do the very best to go back into your community and make that your goal in 2022 is to have that particular act passed, because it gives Jane Doe a stronger voice in her community, in her court system that should be recognized. Why this is extremely important is that one of the scariest things that I faced as a federal prosecutor was the training on what happens if I failed to acknowledge Jane Doe's rights. It meant your name being put in a federal court order. It meant you meant disciplinary action. It meant being sued. And there are suits for hundreds of thousands of dollars against attorneys for failing to acknowledge Jane Doe's rights in the court system. Why? Because at some point in time, somebody felt that her voice was that important that we need to have that written down so that somebody doesn't neglect that part of the process. I can also speak subjectively and tell you that I've talked to many people that have gone into the court system where they have not had their voice heard, did not have the opportunity to discuss a plea, did not have timely notice of a hearing. And if you could hear the defeat that exists in their voice when that happens, they lose faith in their own justice system and their own community. So please, especially leaders that are present today, I encourage you to go back, look at your tribal codes, look to see if you have it. Make it be a point that victims' rights are discussed. Copy the one that I have on my website, change it in any way you want, and pass a Victims' Rights Act. Legislative process, I think my time is going to be running short here soon, so I'm going to start speeding up, but I also think that this is one of the most important components of sovereignty and safety. And I think about it all the time, because every year when I look at the state of New Mexico legislature, you see a group of individuals that are running to Santa Fe to be able to be part of passing a law that impacts their community, impacts them, impacts everybody based upon some type of harm that was done. And so there provides, that to me, that is a concept of sovereignty, is to be able to carry that voice into our governing body and at least advocate or lobby our own tribal leaders for changes in the law when we feel that is fit. In my mind, I envision it happening the same way, where you have a council member that sponsors your particular law. Maybe you have a law in place that is a Victims' Rights Act and you just want to get it through council. Well, you talk to your particular legislative member and try to get that on the agenda. Is this defined anywhere? No. So most tribes do not have a defined legislative process. And so we don't see a frequent change or update to our extremely outdated domestic violence and sexual assault laws. This is something that I feel can be improved. I think it would take, it takes legal work, obviously, for that type of concept to happen. It should be a discussion that tribal bodies start having, a conversation that happens more often, so we can create a voice in our governing body to effectuate change in our own community versus just the federal and state level. Think about how many of us have advocated for changes in VAWA and jurisdiction over non-Indians and jurisdiction to have longer periods of sentences in our tribal court systems. That same discussion should be happening in our own tribal council chambers as well. If it's not happening, it can lead to the diminishment of integrity of sovereignty going forward in the process. The judicial court system is one of the most important forms to have these matters heard. And if we do not have proper recourse in that form, then we are going to be neglectful of those rights again. And every court system at some point in time gets it wrong. And I bring that up as being important because when a court system does get it wrong, in the federal and state levels, you do have a process to seek recourse from that decision that may have not been right. The recourse is going through an appellate process, maybe going to the Supreme Court, relying upon opinions that are published in that process so individuals that go in the court know what the law is in that particular court system. And so one of the recommendations I also have is we all collectively need to do better at actually publishing the opinions that come from our tribal court judge. We have our law and order codes now up on our websites, which is extremely helpful because it educates our community members as to what laws are available in our community. Publishing the opinions on what opinions happen that impact tribal member rights is also extremely important to do. You also have to ask yourself, what appeals body do we have? Is the appeals body the council that appointed the judge or hired the judge? Does that create a bias when it comes to equity in the court system? All questions that we need to ask. We don't like to see that inequity happen on the federal and state level, and I hope that we wouldn't want to see that same type of inequity happening in our tribal court system as well. And the same thing can be said about our government as a whole and accountability. I mean, I've seen the discourse, I've seen the agreements politically happen over time within our tribal communities, and it's becoming something that's impacted us tremendously because there is no recourse when certain things happen. Employee rights, sexual harassment, all of these particular issues matter. If not properly addressed, what are the consequences of such? We see loss of funding. We see a diminishment in our workforce. We may even see a diminishment in our economic stability. We see a different variation of plenary power where our own leadership dictates how things happen without having the voice of the community be part of that. Beyond that, what you see happening from that is that you have people called the ACLU. And I bring that up because also extremely important. The ACLU has historically kept out of the business of any tribal community when it comes to tribal member citizen rights. Within the last year, the ACLU has created an Indigenous Justice Advisory Committee full of Indian law scholars that are addressing this question about whether or not the ACLU should open the door to tribal members that are making complaints about things that have been happening to them within their own community, and they do not have the recourse in their court system. So they're going to the next place over. We need to prevent that from happening. We've got to find a place and ability to have recourse for individuals in these situations. Otherwise, we're going to see a loss of funding, and we're going to see a series of lawsuits that could impact and jeopardize components to what sovereignty is when it comes to federal case law. Going to rush through this one too, but I would just say that part of that process goes back to the historical component to the 1934 passage of the Indian Reorganization Act. Extremely important because that particular act created a boilerplate constitution that so many of our tribes use. That boilerplate constitution was created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One of the things that doesn't exist in that constitution is a separation of powers, which every community has to address on their own. But I can tell you that from what I see, that the lack of separation of powers is part of the issue that's jeopardizing the sovereignty that we have and diminishing the trust in the justice system that we see taking place. And the analogy that I use is that on the federal side, when that same process happened, when the government got too powerful and not looking out for the rights of others, you ended up having the 1960s civil rights revolution. And you had individuals holding signs just like you see now, voting rights, police brutality, jobs for decent pay, all of these issues that exist for us now, and you have people complaining about now in our own communities. We don't want it to happen at that level. Got to do more to recognize those particular rights. I'm going to skip this particular slide just in the interest of time and talk about a few things in closing. You know, the coalition said, well, what are your recommendations? This is a lot of stuff, and it is a lot of stuff. And I would need more time to sit with you all to talk about recommendations and solutions to some of these issues. But I do want to end by saying these are simple things that we can do. Adopt and pass a Victims' Rights Act. I think that all of our communities should have a survivor advocate. What does that mean? It just means that a victim advocate is involved in a case during the period of the case, but every victim advocate in this training today will tell you that they're always involved after the case is over, because that's where healing takes place. Their job description does not include that, but they do it because that's what empathy, passion, compassion is. If the communities, I think that if we had a survivor advocate available to individuals that had suffered past trauma, sometimes they just need help going forward. Schooling, jobs, applying for a job, seeking mental health, getting a driver's license, whatever it might be, having a survivor advocate, I think is extremely important. Consider adopting or creating a defined legislative process. I know that we don't want to have any type of westernized model of a law created process. You can be creative in how to make that as customary and traditional as possible, but I do believe that is something that is absolutely needed because it gives people a voice to help provide our governing body recourse for wrongs and helping them understand what the community is facing. Making mental health and trauma a recurring agenda item. I would highly advise every tribal council to develop a resolution that basically says that in every administration going forward, because we all know that short-term periods make it difficult to be successful in passing certain pieces of law, but creating a resolution that just makes this an top agenda item every year. What are we doing to address mental health and trauma? What laws are we passing to help in that process? Reorganize and restructure social services, I think, is essential. One thing that our tribal communities typically do not have available to them is treatment foster care and the access to that type of treatment when children are experiencing trauma and that they get placed in a foster care that actually has those resources available and trained foster parents to help address it. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where we end up placing children off the reservation into treatment foster programs that are not managed by tribal member families, but they're managed by non-Indians, and that child eventually oftentimes stays off the reservation because of the long-term placement. Lastly, I would say, you know, there's only 1 or 2 tribes in New Mexico that have totally implemented Tolowa or VAWA court jurisdiction. What does that mean? That laws that were passed 10 years ago that give us authority over non-Indians, but also expand our sentencing authority and taking away that power of the federal government from coming in, but taking that ownership on ourselves in our court system, hasn't been done here. And I'm a believer that implementing these particular provisions will also be extremely helpful and overcoming some of these obstacles in the future. I think I hit the end of my presentation. I didn't see my 5-minute thing because I don't see the chat bar, but I do want to say thank you, and I'm going to turn over to a presenter in a second to see if there's time for questions. But this has been a really good experience for me to analyze a lot of the things that I see, to analyze the law that we frequently deal with, and to try to put on a different set of glasses when we're looking at sovereignty, and that's what our leadership can do more of in protecting our community. And I think that we need to attach the word safety to sovereignty more often, so we can understand that part of exercising the ability to self-govern also means passing the laws to protect individuals in our community. Super grateful for all of you listening and for the opportunity to talk today. And I will now turn it over to see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, David, for that extremely informative presentation. It was very educational, including for myself. I did not really think about the aspects that you presented about how, even though we're pushing for all of these advancements, needing our tribes to be properly resourced and prepared on the full implementation of it is going to be vital for continued protection of our sovereignty. And it's such a powerful message. And thank you for sharing your examples. I do want to acknowledge that Deandra, who is participating in the event, did note that it was her sister that you were sharing about. So prayers to her and her family, and thank you for your steadfast advocacy. We do have 2 questions that were submitted by attendees. The first one from Ada Melton, who asked, what's the most helpful technical assistance federal agencies can provide to New Mexico tribes to blend traditional courts with contemporary courts, and also for service providers to do the same? The other question was from Delegate Amber Crotty. She states that Navajo Nation is revising our criminal code. Can you provide an example of wording?
Yes. Ada's question was, what technical federal programs are available? Was that kind of the question? I don't see it, so I'm just.
Yes. Do you want me to go ahead and repeat it?
Yes,
like,
please.
What's the most helpful technical assistance federal agencies can provide to New Mexico tribes to blend traditional courts with contemporary courts, and also the same for service providers as well?
And honest, I don't know the answer to that one. I would just say that I think that when providing that particular service, that in kind of having a mesh of a westernized court system and a traditional court system, is that we have to be cognizant that all care needs to be trauma-informed care. I just know that the number of young women that I've worked with, which is a very, 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 very high number, feel that the justice does not exist for them, and their voice is not the same in many of the communities when it comes to having recourse. And I know that what that does eventually is it turns into a situation where they themselves jeopardize their own health, or end up incarcerated, and doing things that they otherwise would not do, maybe if they had some resources available to them. I think that we've got to do better at creating due process in our court system and acknowledging the rights that exist, and making sure not just, I think the same applies for defendants as well. So I'll get back to Ada. I know who Ada is, and I would love to chat with her more about that. And so thank you for that question, Ada.
Excellent. And then the question from Amber Crotty about Navajo Nation revising the criminal code. Can you provide an example of wording? She gave an example around the issue of strangulation and so on.
Great question. And actually 18 USC 113A8, I think, is the strangulation statute. And to me, one of the most important passages of a particular crime that has the highest indicator for future intimate partner homicide. Placing your hands around somebody's neck and letting them know that you can kill them within a matter of seconds is the most abusive form of control over somebody. The definition for that in the federal statute is better than New Mexico state statute because it does not require visible injury. Some statutes have different language that says, it has to be knowing and intentional. The federal one does not require it to be knowing and intentional. It can be reckless. placing your hands on somebody's neck and inhibiting their breathing in any way, shape, or form through suffocation or otherwise is a violation of the law. I would steal the language from the federal statute on that one because it is actually a really good written statute that came from advocates like all of us that were helpful in passing that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We are at time, but I did want to note that April Sharmley did ask about policing in Alaska. And so I'm hoping, April, that you can connect with David through his email so that he can provide some responses to that. I know that's an extremely important issue. But we want to go ahead and respect everyone's time. And thank you again, David, for your extraordinary presentation. Thank you all for hanging in there with us and getting and soaking up all of this very important information through these presentations. This concludes the first day of the Tribal Leaders Summit. We thank you for spending your morning with us. Again, another round of gratitudes for Hazel Spotted Bird for opening up our space so beautifully with a prayer. To Paula Feathers, really grounding our conversation today and speaking to our strengths and the actions that everyone can take every day. To the wonderful words by the ED of the coalition, Angel Charlie. And then the presentation by Honorable Council Delegate Amber Crotty, one of our steadfast tribal leaders. And again, we welcome you guys to check out the work by Silent James, who's been capturing through images everything that's been shared throughout our time together. And I want to thank again Mary Catherine Nagels and David Adams for their high-level technical presentations. And just let everyone sit with the reminder of all that was shared today, that we do have the power, the strength, and the wisdom to transform this issue in our communities. We can and will be that medicine. And it's you know, very important for everyone to play their role in helping our advocates and tribal leaders implement the solutions that are so needed by our communities. So thank you for spending your morning with us again. We will be starting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Friendly reminder to please be prompt so that we can get started on time. Tomorrow, we'll learn more about legislative and funding updates and hear from the decolonial aunties, which will be very exciting. And we'll watch a special address from Congresswoman Teresa Ledger Fernandez. The portal will remain open for you to continue searching for codes to play our virtual scavenger hunt, Code Quests, and to visit the exhibitors. And so with that, we wish you all a safe and blessed day. Have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.